Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be back in Japan. I very much appreciated the reference to Professor Yuzawa, who I view very much as my teacher. He brought me here for the first time to Japan 49 years ago, and to a very interesting conference at Hakone. What I'm going to be, and I wanted to recognize the close cooperation that we've had with JICA on our research particularly in Africa. And it's been a real pleasure for me to have participated since the beginning on the TCAD initiatives and TCAD meetings, both including when I was at the World Bank and since then on the whole variety. Every one of the meetings has been very interesting. The last meeting was held in Nairobi, and the one before that was in Yokohama. So there have been very interesting opportunities for me to get to meet some of the African leaders and African economists to discuss the development strategies for Africa. What I want to do this afternoon is to talk about some of the particular challenges that are facing Africa and some of the new thinking about development more generally, and try to weave those together in a framework about some strategies for the future of African development. The countries of Africa are facing multiple of interrelated challenges. There are new technologies, there's growing inequality, climate change, problems of employment, population growth. Several of these problems are so severe that in recent years, the last few years, income per capita in Africa has stagnated or even declined on average. There have been some countries that have been doing well, but some countries where things are actually turning down. And this is a very big change from the optimism that we had at the beginning of the century, where we thought that at last the era of decline that had begun in the 1970s, in the process of deindustrialization that marked Africa, partly as a result of structural adjustment programs. We thought that was it at the end, and that was a new era of rapid economic growth. And several of the countries have had rapid economic growth. But what's happened in the last few years is suggests that at least the new challenges are not being met well by some of the countries. And one of the problems I want to talk about particularly here is that the growth model that was very successful in East Asia, which is sometimes called the manufacturing export-led growth model, is not likely to be as successful in Africa. It will play a role, but a more limited role. And that means that Africa will have to think of new strategies, and I'll try to describe what I think are some of those strategies. So today I'm going to focus on that problem and the problems of the challenge of equitable and sustainable growth on achieving the SDGs. So let me begin by explaining a few remarks about the export-led growth model, which was behind the 20th century growth miracles. It led to the unprecedented growth in East Asia, closing the gap in income between and living standards with the advanced countries. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. The Industrial Revolution led to growth in per capita income of maybe 2% at most, a little greater than that. And yet in East Asia, you had growth of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8%. At the peak, it was 10%, 11%. Those have been historically unprecedented. The worry is that model, which began in Japan and then spread around the rest of East Asia, that model, which has proven itself so well, is not likely to work well in Africa. And the reason is very simple. Manufacturing is the victim of its own success. Manufacturing has had enormous increases in productivity. Those increases in productivity have outpaced the growth in demand by a significant amount. And that means the global growth in employment in manufacturing is declining. In other words, the share of labor working in manufacturing is on decline. In a way, it's somewhat analogous to what happened more than 100 years ago with the decline in agriculture. Agriculture was the victim of its own success. We increased productivity in agriculture so much that employment in agriculture went down. 100 and some years ago, the fraction of the labor force around the world in agriculture was over 70%. Now, in the advanced countries, 2 to 3% produce more food than even obese societies like the United States can consume. So the point is that while it's a mark of success, the question for Africa is what will be their way of getting into development. The numbers sort of illustrate this, that the world share of manufacturing has gone down in just 15 years from 19% to 15%, and the share of employment has gone down even more dramatically. So the implication of all this is that Africa will have to find alternative strategies. One way of thinking about this is even with emerging markets taking a larger share of manufacturing jobs, and with the shift of jobs from China to Africa, new manufacturing jobs will only absorb a fraction of the new entrants into the labor force in Africa. So it's expected by the end of the century that Africa will have about 2.1 billion new laborers, people in the working age population, 2.1 billion people, and the entire number of manufacturing jobs in China is only about 80 million. So it can't fill the gap, and all those jobs won't leave China, and even in those jobs that leave China, they'll go to Vietnam and Bangladesh, so that the number of jobs in Africa in manufacturing are going to be only a small fraction of the increase in the labor force. It's still true that manufacturing is going to be important. It can have impacts that are disproportionate to the size, and countries may have a natural comparative advantage in some particular niche, for instance, related to their natural resources, but it won't have the impact that it had in East Asia. There's one more problem, and that has to do with technology, which is one of the topic in the title of the conference. Because of urbanization, advantages of cheap labor will diminish. So when labor is at the center of production, reducing the cost of labor becomes very important. But if goods are produced mostly by machines, then reducing the cost of labor becomes less and less important. So that's why one of the things that we expect to happen is that there'll be more onshoring. But even when the goods move from, even when manufacturing, say, moves back to the United States, not going to happen very significantly, but even when it does, it won't bring jobs back because it will be robots that will be making the textiles and the manufacturing goods. And so that's one of the reasons why President Trump's notion of protectionism as a mechanism of restoring industrial jobs in the United States is empty. It won't happen. And I did want to answer your question about, I agree very strongly that there is a need for new globalization, a rule of law at the international level, and I'll have a little bit to say more about that in our discussion. But I did want to say that really the only way to restore globalization and to restore a global order is to get rid of President Trump. That was not politically correct, but it is the only way. He talks about talking bluntly, but this is the blunt answer to the question that you posed. The problems that I've just described are exacerbated by the development of new technologies, and those are going to be posing some hard questions, and I hope we'll have some time to talk about them in the discussion. For instance, will the new digital technologies make it more difficult for developing countries to close the gap between themselves and the advanced countries? At the World Bank, we've emphasized that one of the things separating developed and developing countries is the gap in knowledge, and these new technologies may make it either easier or more difficult for that gap in knowledge to be closed, depending on how we manage these new technology. An issue that I will have something to say about is, will it lead to increased unemployment and wages and income inequality, even as it increases opportunities for some? So these are some of the challenges that we faced. The changes in technology are a double-edged sword. They open up multiple new opportunities, but there is a real risk that unless adequately regulated, what might be called the dark side will predominate, with more monopolization, more inequality of income, more inequality of voice, more invasion of privacy, more tax avoidance and evasion, and less in tax revenues, less and less secure employment. So these are, we have to be aware of both the positive and the negative that new technologies bring. But they bring particular problems. The problems I just described are for all countries, but they bring a particular set of problems for developing countries because they may make it even more difficult for the developing countries to catch up. One aspect of already been raised is the lack of trust undermining global trade regime and leading to a splinter net, possibly a new Cold War. There are problems that are posed for democracy, and those problems are worse in countries with weaker institutions. There's a problem that the new technologies have of spreading misinformation. And this is a particular concern, for instance, when you have developmentally related information. For instance, the risks of vaccination have become a problem in several of the developing countries. So these are just some of the problems that the new technologies pose for developing countries. Now, I want to spend a few minutes before getting into some of the answers to present a broad perspective on some of the new thinking about development. And that new thinking is really shaped in part by a recognition that the model that dominated development thinking for decades is now basically been discredited, and that was the Washington Consensus model. It was based on a particular view of how markets worked, how the economy worked, that markets by and large worked well, and that development was about making sure that the economy facilitated the creation of markets. And so that was a set of ideas that prevailed from an era beginning around 1980. Those same set of ideas also prevailed in the developed countries. In the developed countries, they were called neoliberalism. In the developing countries, they were called the Washington Consensus. In both cases, they failed. The experiment in neoliberalism with globalization, financialization, undermining of the role of the government, a few people doing very well, but the bottom 90% of America basically stagnated. Just to give you a couple of statistics, wages at the bottom in the United States are the same as they were 60 years ago. And it's hard to believe. The median income of a full-time male worker, and the full-time male workers are the lucky ones, in the United States is the same as it was 42 years ago. Life expectancy in the United States is in decline since President Trump became the president. And not because we aren't doing good research. We know how to extend life, but our economic system and our social system is not working. Well, those ideas that didn't work in the United States and haven't worked very well in Western Europe have worked particularly badly in developing countries, and that's why the Washington Consensus is broadly been rejected. So there are a couple of ideas that have now become much more understood. Development entails structural transformation, and markets on their own don't manage these structural transformations well. This new thinking has led to new strategy, a shift of focus, less emphasis on projects and more on policies and institutions, and a recognition of the importance of norms and mindsets, including the mindset that change is possible. It's a movement away from traditional society towards modernization. One of the insights of the World Development Report of 2015, focusing on behavioral development economics. So I want, a few years ago, a number of the former chief economists of the World Bank, together with a number of other development economists, got together in Stockholm and formulated a set of ideas that were meant to be an alternative to the Washington Consensus. I suppose if we had been more high-tech, we would say a development strategy 2.0 or 4.0. But we called it the Stockholm Statement. It's less glamorous than development strategy 4.0. But it's really trying to rethink in the second decade of the 21st century what good development policy is about. So I just want to read through the basically 8 principles that go into the Stockholm Statement. The first has already been emphasized, that the GDP growth is not an end in itself and does not provide a good measure of success. Development, if it's going to be successful, it has to be inclusive. It has to be sustainable. To achieve this will require a balance between market, state, and community or civil society So it broadens the debate from just the market versus the state to a much broader perspective. It incorporates some things that were talked about earlier, like macroeconomic stability. But even here, there's a difference of perspective. Macro stability does not just mean balancing budgets or focusing exclusively on inflation. It's not just about price stability, but it's about real stability. The sixth principle was one has to pay attention to both inequality and to technology, to changes, to innovation. And in many of the aspects of globalization, the conflict is not between developed versus less developed countries, but the appropriate treatment of labor in both developed and developing countries. And that highlights the importance of investments in human capital, education, and health, which is one of the themes of the TCAD meeting in Yokohama that begins tomorrow. And it also entails both a sensitivity about what gives rise to inequality and about ways of dealing with inequality, including creating new instruments of redistribution within and between countries. The seventh is that social norms and mindsets matter. And this brings in the insights of modern behavioral economics. Already we know that these provide a more effective way of altering certain aspects of behavior, like savings and fertility, at a low cost. And finally, all developing countries operate within an international context, and that global policies do make a difference, and that is part of the responsibility of the international community, recognizing the interdependence of countries, that countries of the policies of the large, rich countries have large externalities on the rest of the world, which they often don't take into account, including their monetary, regulatory, trade, migration, and tax policies. International agreements cover only part of the important arenas that are important to developing countries. Climate change agreement is one example. Climate change is affecting Africa a great deal, and the agreements we haven't gone far enough, and it's obviously disconcerting that Trump has proposed the U.S. leaving Paris. Hopefully we'll have a Democratic administration in 2020, and that won't happen. But there is a lot at stake in the election of 2020. And developed countries have not lived up to their commitments to provide aid and GDP of 0.7%. Private investment can partly make up for it, and that will be part of the discussion in the TCAD, but I want to emphasize that many of the things that are important for development, like education and health, cannot really be, the gap can't be filled by private sector. The Stockholm consensus that I described is a very big change from the Washington consensus in a number of ways. It has broader goals. I've mentioned inclusive growth, climate change, a new perspective on macroeconomic policies. It has more instruments. That it expands what the tools the government can and should employ. For instance, monetary policy, macro stability. Given the importance of structural transformation and the observation I made before that markets on their own don't manage these structural transformations very well, it's particularly important that government play a role through industrial policies. And there are some other distinctions, clear distinctions between means and goals, greater participation, exceeds equality and growth as complements. So that gives you very briefly a perspective on the new thinking about development. Now I want to very quickly talk about how a framework for thinking about how developing countries, including in Africa, need to think about the issue of what do they do now that manufacturing export-led growth isn't likely to be the center that it was for East Asia. And here, the way that I approach the problem is to ask the question, why was the East Asia manufacturing export-led growth model so successful? What did it do? What did it provide for Japan and for the other countries in East Asia? And as we start to deconstruct the reason that it was so successful, we can get a view about what Africa needs to do. Well, it did several things simultaneously. It provided foreign exchange that was important for not just because it gave access to resources, but it solved a really difficult problem, which was a problem that students today don't have to worry about, which is the problem of material balances. In a closed economy, you have to worry all the time that the demand for the goods that you need for development are produced within your country. So you have a really difficult planning problem. You have to make sure that what you produce is exactly what you need. In an open economy, you don't need to do that. You can go ahead with your own plans, and if there are gaps between what you need and what you have, you import the difference. And if you produce too much, you export the difference. So it really solves the most complex planning problem that people focused on in the 50s and 60s. And foreign exchange is necessary for that. Secondly, and I think probably most importantly, export provided the basis of learning. As I said before, what separates the developed from the less developed countries is a gap in knowledge. And the process of learning, the process of export was the basis of learning. I wrote a book with my colleague at Columbia, Bruce Greenwald, called Creating a Learning Society. And that is really what gives rise to development. And part of that was this engagement in exports and in manufacturing in particular. Moreover, exports provided tax revenues that gave the government the resources to invest in education and health and lots of other things that you needed for successful development. So those were three of the things. And a fourth that was particularly important is it generated jobs. It generated employment in the urban sector. And that was key in moving the countries from rural to urban and moving them as agricultural productivity increased. They needed less, there were fewer jobs in farming. You had to move them to something else, which was urban, but you created the urban jobs that they were necessary. So you managed to grow in a way that kept full employment. Well, if manufacturing is not going to do what I've just said it did for East Asia, you still need each of those things. You need jobs, you need foreign exchange, you need tax revenues, you need learning. And what I'm proposing is the new strategy is a multifaceted or sometimes multi-pronged growth strategy with different facets reflecting the different things that manufacturing export-led growth did. So what Africa will have to do is get those various things, revenues, foreign exchange, jobs, and learning through a well-designed strategy which will involve manufacturing, but also agriculture, resources, natural resources, and modern services. So a lot of this is about modern agriculture as opposed to traditional agriculture, using the natural resources not only for foreign exchange, but as a basis of manufacturing in areas where they can have some comparative advantage, and modern services. The strategy will involve choosing subsectors within each that together achieve what export-led growth, manufacturing growth did for East Asia. And there are still many lessons to be learned from East Asia's success: the importance of structural transformation, the importance of education, savings, equality, the role of government, managing finance, and rents such that they serve the productive transformation and innovation. Let me talk now for a few minutes about the response to innovation. As I already mentioned, it's a two-edged sword that it enhances opportunities, it expands the production possibility set, but it also represents a real challenge to developing countries, particularly in the area of employment and in the area of inequality. So this is just a graphical way of representing what an innovation is supposed to do. It moves the production possibility curve out. It, in principle, therefore, could make everybody, here I say workers and capitalists, both better off. But in fact, part of the problem with innovation is if it is labor replacing innovation, robots that replace labor, the wages get bid down, and the result of it is that even though everybody could be made better off, workers are made worse off. So innovation can result in a majority of the population actually being worse off. And that is to say, if the government doesn't intervene to redistribute income that makes people better off. And the role for government is in trying to make sure that the innovation process makes most people in society better off. And there are two ways of thinking about this. First, try to shape the innovation process to make more of the innovations increase the productivity of labor rather than replace labor. We sometimes call it labor augmenting or labor enhancing innovations. Instead of artificial intelligence, you have intelligence assisting innovation. Rather than AI, I call it IA innovation. And secondly, when there are these adverse distributional effects, which there have been, the government has to engage in redistributions to make sure that there are not big losers from the innovation process. The problem in many countries, including the United States, is that rather than rewriting the rules to make the system more equal, the government has been making the system less equal, exacerbating the effects of the changes in technology. So, as an example, some of the new technologies have augmented the power of monopoly. You see that in the Silicon Valley, Google and Facebook, their market power. They've done it exactly at the time where in the United States there is less enforcement of antitrust. So competition policy is weaker. And this is where actually globalization has helped a little bit, because in Europe, they've had stronger antitrust enforcement. That's one example. A second example is that while technology has weakened the power of workers, you might say, globalization has also weakened it. And then we passed legislation weakening unions and further weakening the bargaining power of workers. So even if we had a normal competitive economy, workers would have been worse off. But then we changed the rules of the game to make workers even worse off. And then in the United States, under President Trump, we made things even worse. In 2017, we passed a tax bill. We lowered the taxes on corporations and on billionaires. And amazingly, in a country that has the highest level of inequality in any country in the advanced world, we increased the tax rate on a majority of people in the second, third, and fourth quintiles. In other words, the vast majority of Americans have a tax increase. And they call the bill a tax decrease because corporations have lower taxes. And it was supposed to spur investment, and it spurred share buybacks. It said that the average American would have $4,000 increase in wages. They had that increase in wages of a few pennies. So this was the kind of way in which public policy exacerbates the effects of technology rather than tries to modulate the effects of technology. Now, there is an optimistic view, which is that because innovation gives rise to rents, rents can be taxed without creating distortions, and the proceeds of the taxes can be used to ensure inclusive growth. And there's a broader set of institutional reforms that include attention to regulatory, tax, and IPR regime that have the possibility of ensuring more equitable sharing of the benefits of this economic growth. In the limited amount of time, I won't have time to go through all those dimensions. I just want to mention a couple of things. First, when I said before that we could redistribute income, I said that for a closed economy. Within one economy, everybody's better off. But in an international context, there are some countries that will be worse off. Countries that have a lot of labor, if the demand for labor goes down, those countries are going to be worse off. So that's a real concern about Africa, that it's rich in labor. It's going to be having more than 100% of the growth in the labor force in this coming remainder of this century is going to be in Africa. But if labor is less valuable, that means they're not going to be doing very well. And in addition, natural resource replacing innovation. There's innovation that will make natural resources of certain kinds less valuable. That will be hurting Africa. So the imperative to do something becomes all the greater, but the redistributions will require redistributions from the winners, which are the other countries, to Africa. So it makes the even more imperative for there to be foreign assistance. It also makes it more imperative for there to be rules changes. The international trading rules are designed by and for the advanced countries. You may have heard President Trump say that the global rules for trade are unfair to the United States. Don't believe it. I ask my students, I wrote in Globalization Its Discontents that the rules are unfair to the developing countries. And I asked my students, who do you believe, President Trump or me? And the students all say that I'm right. The fact is that the United States wrote the rules of internationalization with the other advanced countries, but with a dominant voice of the United States, and they wrote them to benefit the United States, or more accurately, to benefit the corporations in the United States. And we shouldn't be complaining about the rules. The people who should be complaining are the developing countries, and these rules have to be written to be more fair to the developing countries. Well, if I had more time, I would go through various aspects of the particular policy responses to these innovations, ensuring, for instance, that we have appropriate intellectual property rules that reflect not just the interest of the advanced countries, but that of the entire world, making sure that there's access to health. The TPP that was aborted, the one part of the TPP that was most objectionable, one of the parts that was most objectionable were the IPR provisions, which would have denied access to health care for poor countries. So I just got a note that I have 1 minute, so let me just go to emphasize 2 points. One is I've highlighted some of the problems that the new technologies result from the new technologies, the problems for employment, but I haven't emphasized as much as I should have the benefits for development if the countries seize them. And there are many examples of this. Financial inclusion, which Kenya has excelled in, potential to raise smallholder agricultural productivity, possible health and education benefits. There are easier access to international markets, greater access to knowledge. So there are many potential benefits if the countries design the right policies. So I don't want to be too negative. I want to emphasize that there are a lot of potential, but one has to be aware both of both sides of this double-edged sword. Finally, I want to say something about the measurement of success, which reiterates what was in the Stockholm Statement. The increases in GDP do not provide a good measure of success, and especially so in Africa and natural resource countries. There has been extensive depletion, for instance, of natural resources and environmental degradation. And I've been involved in a global movement to go beyond GDP that entails trying to assess various other aspects of well-being, including inequality, sustainability, and issues like the creation of livable and dynamic cities. And what one needs is to supplement GDP with a dashboard of indicators. So let me conclude. The successful development policy needs to be explicitly more multi-pronged, addressing the separate challenges that manufacturing sector addressed simultaneously. and that entails a coordinated strategy that has the prospect of attaining the same success as the old manufacturing export-led strategy. It'll be more complex, but I think it can achieve the same kind of success. And we see a few countries in Africa growing at very rapid rate. Ethiopia has been growing at 12% per year. It will need to focus, as Ethiopia has done, on structural transformation, creating dynamic comparative advantages, and responding to the challenges posed by technological change. It will need to focus on the quality of growth, not just the quantity, and using a whole benchmark of indicators, not just GDP. And in all this, government will need to play an important role. It will play a role in the structural transformation towards modern agriculture and service sectors, and from a rural to a modern urban economy. And in a way, this brings us back to a theme that we talked about when I was chief economist of the World Bank, and I still think is relevant, and that is something that is called the comprehensive development strategy. So what I think is needed, in short, is a comprehensive development strategy which leads to inclusive growth with inclusive participation, including a newly restored balance between markets, government, and society. Based on these new understandings of what leads to successful economic and societal transformation and the challenges posed by new technologies and the changing global scene. Thank you.
We will just have a 20-30 minute discussion, just one round among panelists. Then we will open up the floor to collect as many questions as possible. So first panelist is Dr. Hafez Ghanem, Vice President of World Bank. Dr. Hafez Ghanem is Vice President of World Bank for Africa since last year. He is a development expert with over 30 years of experience. His position in the past includes Vice President of World Bank for Middle East and North Africa, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and the Assistant Director General at FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, among others. Dr. Hafez, I have a question to you. As Joe discussed, there's a lot of impact on workers. I'd like to know your view. What kind of impact does globalization have on workers in Africa? I'm very much interested in this hearing from you because you were the core team member of the World Development Report in 1995 on workers in an integrated world. And recently, World Bank published a report on future work in Africa. So I'd like to know your view on globalization and workers.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Joe, for this great presentation. And it's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be on this panel. So thank you for inviting me. Let me try to be very concise. So I would like to make 4 points in response to your questions. The first point is that we need to bear in mind that actually I consider Africa the last frontier. I consider myself an African optimist. Africa is the continent with huge natural resources, whether we're talking about forests, water, minerals. It's a continent of 1.2 billion people. 2/3 of them are less than 25 years old. It is very dynamic. It is a continent which would be a new market. And as Joe Stiglitz said, there are many countries in Africa that are growing at very fast rates. Actually, if you look at the 54 countries in Africa, the vast majority of them are growing at rates between 5% and 7%. Yet, the average growth rate for Africa is less than 3%. And why is that? It's because of the 3 largest African economies that are not growing: Nigeria, Angola, and South Africa. If we take those three out, then you have growth rates of more than 6 or 7%. But of course, taking those three out will be cheating because this is 60% of Africa's GDP, of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. So this was really my first point, is that it is important for all of us to focus on Africa. There is a huge opportunities for the rest of the world in Africa. The second point is that given the youthfulness of the continent, it is also, and if you talk, and you will hear it over the next 2 days, as you will be talking to the African leaders who are coming to Japan for the TCAD, their biggest issue is job creation. Africa needs to create about a million new jobs every month. 1 million new jobs every month. And that is really the biggest challenge. It is an economics challenge, it's a social challenge, it's also a political challenge. Because if all of those young new entrants into the African labor markets, and many of them actually are educated, are unable to find jobs, then that leads to more political and social instability. And that is really, the second point I wanted to make. And linked to that point is that the fact that I actually agree with everything you said, Joe, concerning where will the jobs come from. The labor-intensive manufacturing exports is not going to be the solution for African countries. Technology has shifted. And therefore, a much more multifaceted approach, looking at manufacturing, at services, at natural resources, at agriculture, is really needed. So that really is my second point, is just really to underline that this is a big challenge, and it is not going to be, and just copying what East Asia did is not going to work in the 21st century in Africa. But the third point I wanted to make, which is linked to that, is given this fact, it is extremely important to invest in human capital, in education and health. Because one thing we know is that new jobs will require learning and will require lifetime learning. And when we talk about human capital in Africa, actually might surprise you a lot, but my feeling is that the most important challenge facing Africa today in the human capital side is the role of women. And let me explain what I'm trying to say. If you look at the Human Capital Index for Africa, this is the index that the bank has started preparing about a year ago, the worst numbers come from things like stunting. More than 1/3 of African children are stunted. Child mortality, maternal mortality. And if you look at all of those all of those figures, they are directly linked to very high fertility and very young mothers. The median age for African women to get married is 16.6 years. So that means that half of African women get married before they are 16 years old. And they have children when they themselves are still children. And unless this changes, it will be very difficult to develop human capital in Africa. It will be very difficult. So that requires, you talked about a need for social change and a change in mindset. And this is a very important area where we believe we need to invest in girls' education. We need to invest, we have to be working with thought leaders, with community leaders. We need to create more job opportunities for African women. And it is really important to delay this marriage, ages of marriage, and to bring down the fertility rates for the human capital. The fourth point I wanted to make is really, I'm personally a strong believer in technology, and and the importance of using technology in the African context today. And I was very happy that near the end of your talk, you shifted more to mentioning the positive sides of technology. And what I'm seeing today is that because, let's look at access to the internet. Africa's access to the internet is roughly 1/3 of the global average. Now, if you look at, I see this widening gap between Africa and the rest of the world, but also because access is so limited, it is the elite that is having the access to the internet. And I see a widening gap within African societies. So we need to, if you want to get all of the benefits of this of new technologies, whether it is in job creation, whether it is in better governance. I mean, one of the countries in Africa that has been most successful in fighting corruption is Rwanda. And I was there a week ago or 10 days ago, and I was looking at how did they succeed in reducing corruption so quickly. And one of the elements, it is not the only one, but one of the important elements is using technology. E-procurement is a very strong way of reducing corruption in public procurement, which is the largest source of corruption. So it is really benefits. Also, the importance of technology, when we're talking about the youthfulness of the African society, Africa has all of those young people, very imaginative, very dynamic. And if you come with me, I was in Guinea. I was saying, I just came from Guinea, visited a company there, a startup, led by a young African, that are producing equipment that actually allows people to go to the village dispensary, and this computer gets all of their information, sends it to a doctor who's miles away, and get the information there. So Africa has a lot of opportunities in terms of using technology. Now, but what needs to be done to make sure, and I'll try to be very quick, to make sure that this use of technology, and we can avoid some of the, not all, but some of the negative aspects, especially on income inequality. There is a need to obviously invest much more in infrastructure, what they call also not just the backbone, but the last mile, to make the technology available for people across the continent. You need to invest much more in education and in skills creation for African people. And competition policy is so important. It is unbelievable to me to find that the cost of using the internet in Dakar, Senegal, is roughly twice as high as the cost of using the internet in Washington, D.C. And why is that? It's because a very small number, lack of competition. You basically have one major international company that is doing the access. So dealing with competition policy, opening up, supporting new startups, and so is very important. And then finally, the fourth area is that there are important public platforms that can be developed to that will also have a positive impact on reducing inequality. Joe Stiglitz mentioned fintech, which is very important, and increasing financial inclusion is so important for reducing inequality. One important platform that we are also working on with many governments on is what we call the ID4D, just providing Africans with an ID. Using technology, so that gives them access to all kinds of government services, including, and I'll stop here, very importantly, which is access to the social protection services. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dr. Ghanem. As you said, although Africa has a bright future, there are many problems like gender, education, infrastructure, and inequality. Now turn to Professor Akbar Norman, Columbia University. Professor Norman is an economist with wide-ranging experience of policy analysis in developing countries. In his career, he worked extensively for World Bank, as well as IMF, and at the senior levels of government. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, IPD, Columbia University, one of our co-organizers. He teaches at Columbia University, Oxford University, and University of Sussex. Now, Akbar, what are the new challenges and strategies of Africa to achieve qualitative growth? As we publish, this is a new, recently published volume on quality growth. So what are the new challenges? And as a co-editor of this book, could you discuss those points in introducing our book?
Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and a very hard act to follow, but I'm used to it, as often speak after Joe. So, no, I'll try and do justice to the question you've asked me in the very short time. It's going to be a challenge, that's an additional one. But, you know, as one of the jokes about there are many jokes about economists, as you know, and deservedly so. Economists deserve to be butts of jokes. And one of the jokes is they're so obsessed with goods and services that they are blind to bads and disservices. And that is certainly not the case with Joe Stiglitz, who's been talking about a whole lot of issues about bads and disservices, including in his book, Globalization is Discontent, which he very substantially changed and added to a year or two ago with Globalization Discontents Revisited. And that really focuses on the fact that despite the fact that there's been very rapid growth, unprecedented growth in the post-war era, and particularly in the last 20, 30 years, but there's growing discontent in the world. And it's not just in the developing countries, but it's spread now to much of the developed world. And that raises the question immediately of what is the problem? The problem is certainly the quality of growth. And of course, his answer part, at the most general level, the thing was that globalization has been mismanaged. It hasn't been managed in a way which has led to the right kind of improvements in qualities of growth, translating into well-being, improvements in well-being of most people. And that is a core point about the quality of growth, whether it does so or not. Now, in Africa, there have been two concerns, especially. Well, first of all, let me step back a little bit. Remember that there was a period, as Professor Stiglitz referred to, when Africa was going through a period of economic decline, and then there's been revival of growth, particularly in this century, and in many countries in Africa now are among the fastest growing economies in the world, notably Ethiopia and to some extent Rwanda and some others. But there are real issues about two concerns about in general in Africa. One is, and they center around employment and sustainability. Hafiz Ghanem spoke about the employment challenge. And let me elaborate a little bit on the sustainability issue. Now, sustainability has two dimensions. There's an economic and an environmental one. Is it economically sustainable? And clearly, if you're using up your natural resources, which are depleting, then it's evidently, most obviously, not sustainable growth. What does it require to make it? And the two are really closely related to the issue of generating adequate employment in Africa. Okay? Now, if we look at what we do in this volume, we talk about how the quality of life, growth, now that there's resumption of growth in Africa, the quality of growth becomes much more important. Before that, it was a problem of how do you get growth going. Now you have growth going, so what is happening to the growth in terms of improvements in lives of people, and what does it mean for long-term sustainability? See, as you say, there are a whole range of interrelated concerns. One has to do with equity and how widely shared the benefits of growth are. Do they accrue to a very few or widely shared? The impact of growth on a whole number of non-income dimensions of, if you like, such as employment, health, education, security, very important issue, both economic and physical security, and move away from low productivity primary commodities and an informal sector to modern industry, including modern agriculture, modern activities, I should say more broadly, including industrialized agriculture and services. The management of our urbanization process in a continent which is now the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. And of course, the whole set of issues around climate crisis and environmental sustainability. Now, the volume that we're talking about, the quality of growth, covers all of these issues in varying degrees, a considerable degree actually. And these concerns about the quality that I've referred to, they become all the greater because of the challenges in some way that Professor Stiglitz emphasized about, the demographic challenges, the technological challenges, the changing circumstances in the world that Africa confronts today. Now, which is, so you have all these headwinds. So it becomes very important to focus, as you know, on the multi-pronged strategy, as Professor Stiglitz said. That's one of the implications of what we talk about in the Quality of Growth book. There is also other issues on sustainability, which is the climate crisis, which is impacting Africa very severely. It is the region which has contributed least to global warming, but is supposed to, is now in a position where it's going to be damaged most by the severe environmental consequences that Africa faces. Now, this is, of course, mainly an issue of adaptation, and there the whole global role, international community's role in providing both financial and technological assistance to Africa becomes very important. And this is one of the issues we hope will be taken up at TCAD, and is to be on the item of the agenda of TCAD. Now, there is a whole range of concerns about that, not just about adaptation to climate change, but the role Africa can play in mitigating, although it's not contributed much, not so much because it has a responsibility that much to do, but partly because mitigation technology will offer an opportunity for technological leapfrogging in Africa, and for really cheaper source of energy with the costs of non-renewables falling fairly sharply, and there is a real scope there for a green green development strategy, which will help to also bring about the kind of structural transformation that we've been talking about. And again, as referred to by Hafiz Ghanem, competition policy is very important in this regard in achieving many of these. You gave an example of the cost of using internet. Another example is why fertilizer prices in Africa, which are much higher than the rest of the world recently, sometimes as much as twice as high. And that really impedes the modernization of agriculture, shifting to higher productivity in agriculture. And that is a very important point and something we emphasize in the volume on that. Plus, we talk a lot about industrial policies, which is in a sense a slightly misleading term. We will understand industrial policies to be about industry. It's actually not. It's more accurate to call them learning industrial and technology policies, because one of the most successful cases of industrial policy is the Green Revolution in Asia, where the state played a very active role. By industrial policy really means intervention and policy intervention which alter the allocation of resources and of investments in a different direction than what would happen if you left it entirely to the market. So we emphasize the importance of those learning industrial technology policies to bring about the kind of structural transformation needed for generating sustainable employment-intensive growth, which, as you say, given the difficulties and the headwinds faced by classical manufacturing-led growth, now become much more important in Africa. And generally, the point about adapting lessons of success in East Asia and elsewhere historical experience of now developed countries, as well as Africa's own experience with success recently, particularly. Some countries in Africa have made a very pointed and deliberate attempt to adapt lessons of success, particularly East Asian success, in African context, in their particular country context. And the two leading examples are of that, probably Ethiopia and Rwanda, and these have been some of the most successful economies. So there is really, that sense, there's some very promising prospects, because Africa countries have shown how they can adapt many of these kind of instruments of policies, strategies employed elsewhere to their circumstances, and do so with great success and with great effect. So that is one of the things that we emphasize in the quality of growth volume. There is a whole range of other issues, but I'm not sure I have enough time, but I'd like to come back to that in the for discussion. Let me finally emphasize one of the things that we do emphasize a lot in this volume, is this whole role of changing global rules that Professor Stiglitz also talked about. But again, for lack of time, I won't elaborate on that in detail, but perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Akbar. So you are saying industry policy is needed, but not only manufacturing sector, but also environment, employment, and also competition policy as well. So it's a more broader kind of industry policy is needed for quality growth. Thank you very much. So Joe, do you have any additional comments, or would you like to make intervention now?
No, we can.
Okay, yeah, okay. Then maybe we can collect questions. Then maybe panelists will answer. So maybe I'd like to collect 3 questions each. First round is 3 questions. Then maybe we can move on to second round.
お話ありがとうございます。例えばアフリカに進出するゼネコンさんだとかのアドバイスを行っているんですけれども、例えば南スーダンであったりですとか、そういうかなり復興といいますか、開発の段階にあるところにまず日本の企業さんって進出しようとなさらない中で、ただそれは資本主義の中で企業さんが利益を追求するのは当然だと思うんですけれども、そうした状況の中で民間企業がどのようにSDGs であったりだとかにプロアクティブに関わっていくことができるのか、企業益を追求しながらもそういったSDGs の達成にどのように貢献していけるのかをお伺いできればと思います。
Okay, so maybe how to compromise private return, social return. じゃあ2つ目に行きましょうか。できれば若い方から行きたいんですが、じゃあその少し後ろの、男性の方。
Thank you for your great presentation. I'm a second-year student of明治 University, and I have a question about the African nation. That the border issue, and in my opinion, I think the border issue have been a main disturbance for African nation to develop to the next level, and from where they are. So, in my opinion, the investor and the chief executive of the company are trying to invest in the African nation, but they are worried about the kind of the war in African country, and that can be a main disturbance for African nation growth, and that also related to the growth of inequality. How do you think about this matter, and how the African nation deal with this problem from now on and this time? Thank you.
はい、じゃあもう一つ、この第1ラウンドでいきたいと思いますけれども、ちょっと手がこちら側ライトがあってよく見えないのですみません、手を挙げて、はい、じゃあさらに後ろに行きましょうか。はい。
Thank you very much for your very stimulating presentations. And I have a question about what panelists think about vulnerability aspects. for example, beyond GDP, I had a chance to work with small island countries which are part of Africa. And so when you talk about continent, there are island countries who consider themselves part of Africa. And they not only face the climate change crisis, but also many countries depend on tourism. So when there is a financial crisis in Europe and other places, they're directly impacted. So I'd like to know your thinking about vulnerability issues beyond GDP. Thank you.
Vulnerability, you mean conflict and those kind of things?
Vulnerability is like fragility. In terms of environment, economic, and also impact on social aspect as well. Thank you.
I see. So now we have 3 questions. First question is private return for enterprise and how we can reconcile with social return. Maybe Joe, just.
Yeah. I think that maybe I should begin by an observation. About a week ago, the leaders of America's major corporations, almost all of them, issued a statement saying that they no longer believed in shareholder capitalism, that the objective of the corporation should not be just to maximize market value, profits, shareholder value, but that it should have a wider obligation to their workers, to communities. Now, many of us don't really believe that they believed it, that this was PR because the corporations have gotten such a bad reputation after the financial scandal, after the opioid scandal, the environmental scandal of the automobile industry. So the corporations are not, and the tax avoidance of Apple, and so the companies have not gotten a good image, and so there's been their response is publicity, is to say that we serve the whole community, just not just our shareholders. As I say, there's a certain amount of skepticism, but there's also a grain of truth in what they're saying. And I think it's an opportunity because I think many of the CEOs, they have families, they live in a community, they are aware of their social responsibility. So I think that some of them see the possibility of both serving their shareholders and serving the broader community, including development, as something that they should be engaged in. It's also, I know this more from the United States, that a lot of the young people have the view they only want to work for firms that are doing good. That companies like Facebook are now having trouble recruiting workers because the idea that you're working for a firm that is not serving society, there are other firms they'd rather work for, even if they don't get as much pay. So it's even good business for them to have a broader social objective. There are also particular real profit opportunities in, say, Africa. If you look at the gaps they have in energy, in telecom, there are lots of areas where there are very large profitable opportunities. And this is one of the things that the development banks can help do is facilitate that investment by some degrees of risk mitigation, by some ways of sharing the risk. There's a branch of the World Bank called MIGA, which provides insurance against expropriation. But expropriation risk is not the major risk that people face today. There are a whole set of other risks. And one could imagine developing financial instruments that would help absorb some of those risks. And some of the development banks are thinking about those broader kinds of risk mitigation. But finally, let me say, I think a lot of the major issues cannot be addressed just by the private sector. The private sector has an important role to play, but it is a mistake to think that the private sector can really solve all of these problems, especially in the absence of good regulation. The private sector created inequality, they created environmental disasters, they created a lot of the health problems. So you can't expect them to solve it. Now, if we had good environmental regulations, if we have good health regulations, we can mitigate some of these problems. But and just give you one more example of an important, we talk about health. The major source of problems in health, at least in the advanced countries today, are you might call lifestyle issues. Why is life expectancy in the United States going down? It's partly because of drug overdose of opioids, but it's also because of childhood diabetes caused by our Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, by the soda drink manufacturers and the food industry. So the food industry is actually having a very negative impact on health in the United States, and it's also true in Africa as well. So when we think about it, at the very least, the private sector should do no harm.
How about other two, Joe? How about the other two comments? How can we make African growth more equitable and also vulnerability?
On the issue of vulnerability, I think this is actually very important both at the individual and the national level. And it's one of the areas that when we talk about increasing the dashboard measures, our GDP doesn't talk about vulnerability. At the national level in 2007, 2006, the US economy looked like it was doing very well, but there were some real vulnerabilities economically. And many of us would say that environmentally, the US had large vulnerabilities that were not being reflected. In 1 year alone, on climate-related events caused by global warming, which the United States president still denies, US lost 2% of GDP. Over $300 billion in damage from climate change related events. So that's a kind of vulnerability that is very significant. We managed to absorb it, but you take a place like Puerto Rico and its vulnerability has been enormous. So I think part of the thing is we need indicators of vulnerability so that we are aware of them, both at the individual and national level. And secondly, this is where diversification becomes very important, that the natural resource dependent countries need to diversify, and the tourist dependent islands need to diversify. And for the small islands, it's a real challenge. I don't want to say it's easy, but there has been a de-diversification that has happened in the past without a sufficient awareness of how moving away from a diversified economy makes the economy more vulnerable, and partly because we don't have the good indicators of that.
Dr. Ganem, do you have any comment, especially private return and social return? Maybe I'd like to know your view on that.
Well, yeah. Well, if I may, I mean, there was also the second question, which you started talking about borders and then as a hindrance to development, and I thought you were going to talk about the small size of African economies, and then you discussed also wars and conflict. So, I mean, there are 2 points in this question that I would like just to stress. The first point on actually borders. Borders in Africa are were drawn by non-Africans and often do not make much sense for Africans, especially do not make much economic sense. Before I talked about the problems when I was mentioning the price of access to the internet in Dakar, Senegal, and how expensive it is. And when I start talking about with the market participants, why is it that we have a monopoly or a duopoly and the price is why, they say the market size is very small. So it is really important and to, I believe, for Africans to do a lot of economic integration to increase the size of their markets. And they have one of the initiatives that has been approved and just signed by African heads of state last month is the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So that will create hopefully one African market. The implementation, it is a political decision, implementation of this Continental Free Trade Agreement will be challenging because there will be institutional issues, infrastructure issues and so on, but it is something to really aspire for. As I keep telling my people in Africa, it's a continent with 1.2 billion people. That is the size of India exactly. But India is one market, Africa is 54 markets. So how can we do that? But on the other aspect, which is conflict, and actually most of the conflicts I know in Africa are not linked to borders. Most of the conflicts are internal civil strife. They're mostly linked to, if you look, let me give you one example that people talk a lot about, Mali today. Mali and the whole Sahel region, which is heavily impacted by conflicts. The conflict in the Sahel is affecting GDP, the growth, jobs, and increasing poverty. But we always think of the causality going from conflict to bad economics, basically. But actually, I also think that bad economics leads to conflict. And if you look at, I'll give you this very specific example of Mali and the conflicts which are in the north, started in the north and now moving to the center. And there are two drivers of this conflict. One important driver is the absence of government services in the north. So if government is not providing health services, not providing water, is not providing electricity, is not even providing security. So somebody comes in, some extremist group comes in and says, I will provide it for you. Unless you work with the communities, to recreate government's credibility in those regions, there will always be conflict. In other parts, if you go to a place in North Africa, go to a place like Egypt or Tunisia, where you have large numbers of youth from Tunisia, the largest number of young people going to join the Islamic State were Tunisians, and most of them highly educated. And why? It is because they feel left out. It is basically a feeling of injustice, of young people feeling that they have gone through the education system and that they deserve, that society owes them a job, owes them a certain quality of life, and they do not get it, and that gives to a rejection. So working on development issues, whether it is government credibility in certain areas like in northern Mali, or whether it is creating opportunities and hope for young people in Tunisia or Egypt, I think is important for dealing with the conflict situations.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to go for second round. Let's go to the middle. The gentleman over there with 半袖の方です。はい。
ありがとうございます。今日 興味深いお話ありがとうございます。インターネットの利用の話が少し出たんですけれども、まだあまり注目されてないかもしれないんですけれども、2、3年後までにですね、アフリカの全地域、僻地まで含めてですね、衛星からですね、ブロードバンドにつなぐという計画がもう進んでいてですね、そうなることが、例えばソフトバンクのプレスリリースなんかで発表されてるんですけれども、そうなった場合に、どんなことができるかとかですね、それをラーニングソサエティの構築というところでどういうふうに役立てられるかということについて少しご意見をいただきたいと思うんですけど、お願いします。
インターネットとラーニングソサエティの関係ということですね。はい、あと2つじゃあ取りたいと思いますけど、ではあちらの、左側の方にいらっしゃる男性の方ですね。前の方です。前が来ますので少しお待ちください。
すみません、大変興味深い話ありがとうございます。今さっきかなり政府の信頼を醸成しなければいけないとか、その政府っていうのが積極的な役割を果たしていくべきだっていう話が非常にあったんですけれども、こういうことをあまり経済学者、特にマクロ経済の専門家に言うと怒られるかもしれないんですけれども、アフリカとかアフリカからその黒海地域にかけてっていうのは非常に主権国家が弱い地域であって、じゃあそこにおいて本当に政府がいる必要があるのかっていう問題から入ってしまうんですけれども、じゃあその政府がその役割を果たす必要はあるのか、実際にそこにはトランスナショナルなコミュニティだったりとかがさまざまな部分でネットワークを形成して、セーフティーネットみたいなものを作っている。じゃあそこに主権国家というものが介在してわざわざ政府がやる必要があるのかっていうのが、特にこういうことは人類学者とかがよく言うと思うんですけれども、そういうのがメインの質問です。はい、すみません、よろしくお願いします。
ガバナンスとマーケットの関係ということです。ガバナンスと政府の産業政府の関係ということでしょうか。もう一つじゃあ取りたいと思いますけれども、では真ん中のカメラの右側にいらっしゃる方、そうです。
And thank you very much for the discussion and the presentation. And in Japan, we still have a problem still we have a problem of gender equality and having a problem where government is not paying much budget for the cyber security. And in the presentation, I understood that what you need to do to develop the Africa, improving education and for the gender equality. But question is, how do you develop it without having that kind of a problem, and how long does it take to complete the development, not having the support from the other countries? Thank you.
ちょっと私今質問がよく分からなかったので、もう一度ちょっと最後のところおっしゃっていただいて。Could you repeat again? I couldn't get your point.
じゃあ日本語で言います。最後ら辺の質問は、他の国々からのサポートを受けずに独立した形で発展が完了するかどうかを聞いています。はい。
Okay, now we have got three questions. One is Internet and Learning Society, and second is governance and market, governance and industry policy, and the third is related to aid, international aid.
Okay, on the first question, first let me emphasize what was said earlier about the importance of competition and getting prices down. That it's not only the availability of the internet, but it's accessibility, and that means price. And it was mentioned that in Senegal, the price was twice the United States. The price in the United States is much higher than in many other countries because the United States doesn't have good competition policy. So this is one of those areas where even country, I mentioned that U.S. has had real problems and lack of competition, it's showing up, I think, in the pace of innovation in the United States, which has been slowing down in recent years. So the capacity of a satellite system to deliver access to learning will depend very heavily on price, and that may depend on regulations that governments impose and on whether there's competition. It's obviously the case that if you can bring down the price of access to the internet, it puts at everybody who has an adequate elementary and secondary education access to a huge body of knowledge, provided they can have an iPhone. Now, an iPhone is out of the reach of many people in Africa, and so this then opens up the point that one can create libraries where in the library the main thing to have is just a few low-grade computers that can interface with the internet. And you then have a library effectively with more books than anybody had 40 years ago. So in that sense, I think it can have an enormous potential. I want to say a brief answer to the last question and then come up to the middle question. In terms of the last question, I do, as I mentioned, I think particularly the poorest countries in Africa are going to need some support from others. But one of the things that we've all emphasized at one point or another is that the rules of the international game make a big difference. So if, you know, I mentioned the rules were biased against developing countries. One example of that is a system of tariffs which is called escalating tariffs. You have the lowest tariffs on raw materials and then higher tariffs on more value-added. The impact of that structure of tariffs is to try to force Africa to be nothing more than a producer of raw materials and for the value added to occur in the advanced countries. And this was part of the structure of tariffs that was in the WTO. And one of the things that in 2001, when they began a development round of trade negotiations, was to change those rules. But the United States and Europe refused. They refused to really comply with a development or what they had committed themselves to in the developmentally oriented trade negotiations. And so they said they're only looking at the average tariff. And what matters is not only the average tariff, but the structure of tariffs. So that's just one example of how the rules of the game can help facilitate development. And what is needed is, we used to have a debate, trade, not aid. The point is we need trade and aid, and we need particularly the design of the global rules to help developing countries develop. The second question was about the problem of the role of government in Africa where there's weak government. And here I have just a couple points. The first point I wanted to make was that when talking about government, what I was really meaning was it's important that there be some kinds of collective action. The notion that everybody individually, individual firms, could solve all these problems is just wrong. There needs to be people collectively cooperating together. The collective action could be at the level of the community or the level of the nation state or the region, Africa Union together, and it'll have to be all of those. The second point I wanted to make is that we forget that in the beginning of the East Asian transition 50, 60 years ago, governments in East Asia were not, governance was not that good in East Asia. You look at several of the countries in East Asia, and they were marked by high levels of corruption. And one of the things, part of development is strengthening government. And one of our criticisms of some of the Washington Consensus policies was that they led to a weakening of government. So rather than developing institutions that would help engage in collective action, they actually weakened it. And we had a book at the IPD called Good Governance, and maybe Akbar wants to say a few words.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, that's a very important point about a lot of widely held views about Africa is that, governance issues and conflict issues really hold back development. But a lot of work has shown that actually a number of African countries have good enough governance to be able to implement the kind of policy that East Asian countries were so successful with, and they've demonstrated that. The other point is more generally that governance capabilities don't come like manna from heaven. It's not that one day Korea woke up and said, oh my God, we have all these governance capabilities so we can do all these wonderful industrial policies. They have to be constructed. And as Joe has emphasized, as part of the development process is to build those governance capabilities. And the other kind of research which shows that actually, it's not that you have some kind of a relationship between governance issues and ability to develop in general, but that if you take away rich countries out of the equation, if you just look at developing countries, the relationship between governance and corruption indicators and growth is all over the place. There is no such relationship, which is not to say that governance is not important, not to say corruption is not important, they're highly important, but the way in which they interact with development is a much more complex process, and it really shows that what counts in the end is success, and if you have success in economics, you get better governance and you get the other kind of issues of fragility and conflict, as you were mentioning. It's not, the way the causality runs is that both ways. It's that better economic policies and so on, and economic success leads to better governance. They also lead to less conflict and so on. So there's a virtuous circle and vicious circles involved in these phenomena. And to remind you, coming back to East Asia, in the 1960s, a widely held view was that East Asia was the sick man, was what Gunnar Myrdal called, what was the phrase he used for Asia, the soft states of Asia, which are unable to deliver on development. And Asia was the region which was widely conflict-ridden. There was the Korean War had just finished, insurgency going on in Malaysia, there was Sukarno and Suharto, or the overthrow of the coup, with millions dying, and a lot of conflict in the region. That's just before the economic takeoff. And with the economic takeoff, to some extent, contributed to the lessening of a lot of these tensions, creating the virtuous cycle of Asian stability. But things looked very different 10, 15 years after the economic success, but that it did at the 1960s, in the early mid-60s, when Africa became independent and Asia was the conflict-ridden region with issues of governance and corruption. So a lot of it is to do with the kind of economic policies that deliver success. They also deliver on other fronts. And to that, you have to have, part of that has to be building the governance and government capabilities.
Thank you. We'd like to continue more, but we panelists need to leave here. We are already over 4 o'clock. And actually, Dr. Ghanem came here from the airport, so thank you for taking your time for us, joining us for today. では皆さん、パネリストの皆さんにですね、盛大な拍手をお願いいたします。This is our students from Meiji University. So this is we'd like to write some articles. So we'd like to interview you. Just 15-20 minutes. So,
Students are the most important people to meet.
yeah, thank you very much for saying that. So is there any questions? Yeah, maybe you can start.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. And having watched your video about your activities and gone through your easy to understand presentation, I have one question. Actually.
Only one?
Maybe, but we don't have time. Okay, and my question is concerning global trade. As you know, developing countries mainly raw materials include agricultural and mineral. And the prices are decided by developed countries, and government subsidies are in favor of their products. And there is no fairness with poor people and countries. And how new technologies could contribute to change the current situation, and what should be done for new World Trade Organization rules for more fairness and equality for better growth globally.
Yeah. So it's a good question, and let me preface it by saying that one of the things that's changed dramatically between when I wrote Globalization, Its Discontents and today is that 15 years ago, everybody understood that it was important to have rules, but the question was which rules, and could we design rules that were fair to developing countries? Now, the United States has a president who doesn't believe in rules. He believes in the law of the jungle, where the big guys get to beat up on the small guys. And I think it's bad for the United States. I think it's bad for the world. And so the first battle we are fighting right now is to save the WTO. And that's a very big battle where the voice of Japan ought to be heard more loudly. The US has refused to allow the appointment of new judges to the appellate body of the WTO. And probably by the end of this year, that will mean the appellate body will not have a quorum, and so the WTO will be totally ineffective for resolving disputes. So you can't have a way of resolving disputes if you have no judges. And U.S. realized that. It couldn't, rather than having a global debate, it's killing it. There's a very easy answer. The rest of the world should go ahead and appoint new judges. And if the U.S. refuses to recognize them, you say, that's your problem. The rest of the world will be governed by a rule of law, even if the U.S. wants to be a renegade. So that's the most important. Now, the second issue is obviously, if we have a rule of law, we have to try to make it a fairer rule of law. And by that I mean one which is pro-development. And as I mentioned, there was an agreement in Doha in 2001 to create a development round to make the international rules promote development. But the US and Europe basically refused.
Maybe Japan as well.
Maybe I didn't want to say that, but it basically, it was US, and this goes to your part of your question. When I say fair, I mentioned one thing, which was the escalating tariffs, but an even bigger issue is developing countries produce agricultural commodities, and the developed countries subsidize enormously, and that, why is that unfair? It depresses the price of those goods that developing countries export. And the most outrageous example of this is the cotton subsidies. because the cotton subsidies go to very few farmers in the United States, about 25,000. Most of the money goes to even a smaller number, and we're talking about billions of dollars. And the effect of that is to depress the price of cotton, and that means 10 million farmers in Africa alone, more than 10 million, get pushed below subsistence, and in India and elsewhere. And so, and the effect of it means the United States would not be an exporter of cotton, and now it's the largest exporter of cotton because of the subsidies. And the irony, of course, is the U.S. makes, and Europe, make a very big criticism of any country that subsidizes. They criticize China for subsidizing industrial goods, but yet they're subsidizing agriculture massively. And Trump is very open now as part of the trade war. He's giving even more subsidies to American agriculture. So I think the only way to address this is to continue to expose the inequity. Hope that most people around the world realize that this is an unfair system, and even in the United States and even in Europe and Japan, there'll be a consensus that this is not the right way to go.
The negative side of the negative impact of the new digital technologies, and in the presentation you showed some negative impacts of new digital technologies to Africa. So, because of the lack of credence or by the fake news, so how will the system of the AI society have impacts, and then how should we treat it?
So I think that the I mentioned this very briefly in my talk that this is one of the downsides of the new technologies, and it's particularly troublesome for developing countries because they may be more vulnerable. The example I gave was the anti-vax movement, and in Pakistan, I believe, it's been very successful linking the vaccines to the CIA and the U.S. government. And the result of that is that polio, and smallpox or just polio? Polio has come back to Pakistan. And after almost being wiped out. For the problem has appeared in the United States, the measles are coming back, but in the United States and in places like Italy, they can say you cannot go to school unless you get vaccinated. And so we have institutions that can stop some of the damage, but in Pakistan, it's been almost impossible to deal with the anti-vax. But the broader issue of democracy is we've seen how Russian intervention played a role in the American election. It played a role in the Brexit vote. It played a role in the Catalonia independence. And what makes it, in the case of Russia, so toxic and so difficult is their only objective is to disrupt. So it's not like you can think there's a rational strategy that they have one objective, which is to undermine Western democracy. So that's very difficult to combat. I think countries are going to have to take a more active role in two ways. One of them, or maybe more than two ways, but one of them is we've always had a delicate balance between free speech and societal objectives. So for instance, the US has a very strong, what we call First Amendment free speech, but even the Supreme Court said you can't cry fire in a crowded theater. You can't engage in pornography of certain kinds, child pornography, because they are so destructive of our society. In Germany, because of what happened in World War II, they've passed laws that you can't have hate speech. You can't cite ethnic violence and things like that. So I think it's a very delicate balance, and it's really dangerous because demagogues like Trump would use this as an excuse to shut down the press. So one may have to redefine the boundary more delicately if one can create good institutions. One of the things that the countries that have been most immune are countries like Sweden, where there is a good public broadcast TV station, radio, and where they have created a diversified media. And the government subsidizes the media. And so you have a more robust media space. In the United States, we have a problem because we have Fox News, where you have one rich person, Murdoch, trying to undermine American democracy. So we have a problem, and we don't have a good public system. So I think creating a public system, if you can do it well, and UK has done it well, Norway, Sweden, many countries have done it well.
Even BBC.
What?
Even BBC.
Even BBC. Yeah. It didn't immunize them against a lot of really fake news in the Brexit vote. There were a lot of statements that were just lies that were made during the Brexit vote. So that's always going to be a problem in our democracy. It's always been a problem. But the new technologies have made it a much worse problem because you get they can go viral very quickly. One of the ways that you can reconcile free speech with this problem is what France did. They slowed down the internet and slowed down the ability to make things go viral. And they said Russia tried to give some fake news during their election, and they basically said you can't spread the news for 2 days. So they didn't censor, but they said you can't spread news so quickly. So it was a question of speed, and of course what they want to do is get the fake news out there before anybody can counteract it. So this says, well, maybe we need speed bumps in our technology.
Thank you.
That's why he's using Twitter so much.
That's right. Now but he doesn't care about the truth. I mean, and one has to understand. He has no. Trump doesn't care about the truth, nor does Fox News. And a third of the 30% of Americans listen to Fox News, and so they're getting bombarded with things that are, you know, literally just made up. You can't believe, you know, every once in a while, I don't watch Fox News, but sometimes I'll be in a TV station, you know, doing an interview, and you get to see all the, they always have all the stations, so they know what everybody else is doing. And you look at, one day I was there, and they had a picture of showing an invasion from Central America into the United States. And they had the picture of the long army of, you know, of people coming, and the picture was to try to get Americans scared that there would be this invasion from Central America. And if you looked at that show and you see this long, you might have gotten scared.
Today's discussion is what says that Africa is last frontier. In the society where globalization advances, it is difficult for us to get benefit from geographic space and financial space. This may mean that the end of capitalism starts. If the capitalism finishes, how will the world change?
I think the market economy is going to be, it has a lot of benefits and is an important part of our economy, of our society. But the problem is not, is the market economy, if it's unregulated, if it's not motivated well. And I mentioned the movement from maximizing shareholder value profits to stakeholder, looking at all, and that has to do corporate governance laws that regulate the corporations. For instance, in the United States, the CEOs often get paid by shares, and their incentive is to try to increase the value of the shares, no matter what. And that may mean they may lie, or they may do anything to increase the value of the shares. And so one of the reforms is to say you have to hold your shares for at least 10 years, or you get taxed very heavily. So then you have to think about the long run. So when companies just think about the short run, the share may go up, but then it'll go down. Like all the companies that pushed the opioid drugs, they made a lot of profits in the short run, but now they're going to be paying billions and billions of dollars in fines. And the same thing, our banks made money in the short run, but our banks have paid over $100 billion in fines for their bad behavior. So that's short-term thinking. And there are other rules, like another rule is that the shareholder, that those who hold shares for a long time should get more votes than those who are short-term. So, and some of it is also norms, you know, persuading the CEOs and the management, you have a responsibility to society. So, an example, in Norway, everybody who joins the company, including everybody on the board of directors, is given a copy of the Declaration of Human Rights. And they're told that everything the company does has to be consistent with the Declaration of Human Rights. So it just, you know, it just puts people thinking about human rights on the agenda.
But you're right, if capitalism does not reform itself, it faces extinction.
Thank you, Joe, for